The Titanic set sail from Southampton to New York. This massive ship, dubbed unsinkable, didn't even complete its maiden voyage. On the 15th of April, 1912, it struck an iceberg and sank to the bottom of the ocean. When the Titanic went down, more than 1,500 people aboard lost their lives with it. As the world was left in shock by the destruction of what was once the largest and most luxurious ship, and the death of thousands, explorers and researchers began an around-the-clock effort to locate the Titanic at the bottom of the ocean, thousands of meters deep. But the North Atlantic seemed to keep the Titanic hidden in its depths. Again and again, search missions failed. First it was a few months, then years, then decades passed and still no sign of the Titanic. By 1980, many researchers had already given up the search, but oceanographer Robert Ballard remained passionately committed to the mission. He never intended to give up. In fact, Robert had already made several previous attempts to find the Titanic, but like other search teams, he had failed. Still, he remained steadfast in his pursuit. In 1982, he partnered with the U.S. Navy to accelerate the search. Finally, Robert and his team's efforts paid off. In 1985, exactly 73 years after the Titanic sank, the ship was finally discovered. When the Titanic appeared before the world for the first time, everyone was astonished. The once most luxurious ship on Earth now lay 12,400 feet beneath the Atlantic Ocean, struggling to survive against seawater and bacteria. So, why did it take over 70 years to find the Titanic? And how did Robert Ballard manage to discover it? After the Titanic sank, its tragedy became more famous than the ship's beauty and design. As a result, anyone who talked about recovering the Titanic made front-page news. In reality, efforts to recover the Titanic began almost immediately after it sank. Explorers were hopeful, because before the Titanic went under, it had sent distress signals received by the ship Carpathia. Carpathia had recorded its coordinates and used them to rescue over 700 people. So it was widely assumed that if the lifeboats were found near the signal coordinates, then the Titanic must be nearby. But they overlooked one critical detail. Carpathia received the distress call 2 hours before the Titanic actually sank, and during those 2 hours, the sinking ship could have drifted to another part of the ocean. No one knew how deep it had sunk. Moreover, searching the area near the signal coordinates was extremely difficult. For one, weather in the North Atlantic is brutally harsh. Completing such a mission in that environment was no easy task. On top of that, there were no advanced tools back then capable of locating the Titanic thousands of meters below. Even so, some people still tried to find the Titanic, especially because many victims came from wealthy families such as the Guggenheims, Astors, and Wideners. These families formed an organization and signed a recovery contract with a marine surveying company. But due to limited technology and lack of modern tools, divers couldn't withstand the increasing water pressure, so they couldn't reach the ocean floor. The project had to be canceled. In March 1914, an architect from Denver named Charles Smith proposed an idea: combine electromagnets with a submarine. He believed that electromagnets could pull the sub toward the Titanic's steel hull, pinpoint its location, and then use electromagnetic testing to lift the ship. But this theory was completely unfeasible at the time, and the plan would have cost nearly $1.5 million, the equivalent of over $45 million today, so it was scrapped. As the years passed, theories about how to find the Titanic continued to emerge, but all proposed methods remained just that, theories, wasting time and money when applied in practice. Meanwhile, the world was going through World War I. Almost every nation was struggling with economic crises and political tension. Famine was widespread, and war and unrest made conditions unbearable. With limited technology, no meaningful search could be conducted for decades. In July 1953, 41 years after the Titanic sank, the world's leading deep-sea recovery company, Rosenberg, based in Southampton, launched an official mission to find the Titanic. They set off underwater explosions at suspected coordinates to create sound wave responses, using sonar devices to record the echoes, trying to pinpoint the wreck's location. But both the 1,953 and 1,954 missions failed, and the search was called off. Though the public's fascination with Titanic never faded, repeated failures crushed the spirits of explorers. Searching in dangerous weather and brutal ocean conditions required enormous funding, and no one could guarantee results after investing so much. Without special technology, finding a wreck miles below the surface was like shooting arrows in the dark. As a result, based on past expedition records, throughout the 1,962nd and 72nd, no proposed Titanic searches received funding or support. So, 65 years after the Titanic went down, it still hadn't been found. In 1977, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution developed a new surveying tool to map the seafloor and assigned Robert Ballard to test it. As an oceanographer, Robert had worked at the institute for years. The institute wanted to test its new equipment, and Robert wanted to use it to find the Titanic. He had been dreaming of this since 1973. In October 1977, he launched his search for the Titanic. Robert used the drilling ship Deep Sea Explorer, which had sonar and a camera mounted on the drill pipe. However, the moment the drill pipe was lowered into the sea, it snapped, and all the expensive equipment fell to the seafloor. Robert Ballard's first attempt to search ended before it even began. But he wasn't someone who gave up easily. After this failure, he started developing underwater robots that could move along the seafloor and collect images and data. Around this time, an oil tycoon named Jack Grimm entered the picture. He was a rather eccentric man known for investing in odd and unrealistic projects. Previously, he had donated $300,000 to a science center in Laguna Beach run by Northrop Grumman for consulting help and brought some equipment and staff onto his team. But Grimm was notoriously difficult to work with, and one incident made that clear. When scientists and engineers began studying seafloor maps to search for the Titanic, Grimm brought along his pet monkey, claiming that wherever the monkey pointed on the map, the Titanic would be. At first, the scientists thought he was joking. But when Grimm insisted, they gave him an ultimatum: choose the monkey or them. Shockingly, Grimm chose the monkey and the scientists stormed out. Eventually, Grimm's team persuaded them to return, but only if he left the monkey out. In July 1980, Grimm and his team of scientists and sailors began searching using the Shannon system and a magnetometer. Shannon mapped the seafloor, and the magnetometer detected metal objects beneath it. However, bad weather made the mission extremely difficult, and after 3 weeks, their first expedition was forced to end. During that trip, Shannon scanned about 500 square miles of ocean and identified 14 suspicious targets, but the Titanic remained hidden beneath the waves. Even after 3 separate attempts, Grimm never found it. It was only years later discovered that, in 1980, Shannon had passed right over the Titanic and still didn't detect it. In another 1981 expedition, Shannon came within 1.5 miles of the wreck but again found nothing. Of course, this was only known after the Titanic was finally discovered. It hadn't helped the search efforts back then. The Titanic had sunk in 1912, and even after 70 years, it remained lost. The world was both astonished and captivated. The greatest explorers, scientists, and businessmen in the world had all tried to find it, and all failed. But Robert Ballard had learned from his failed 1,977 mission and was preparing more carefully for his next attempt. From 1,980 to 1,983, each of Jack Grimm's search missions made headlines and documentaries. Robert followed the entire process closely. He was planning a better strategy for his next move. He wanted to develop remotely operated submersibles that could navigate the seafloor, transmitting images and samples back to the control room. But Robert had to face countless challenges on his own because developing such advanced technology required a lot of funding and teamwork. In 1982, he proposed a partnership with the U.S. Navy. Robert had been working with the Navy since 1967. In the past, the Navy had also funded several research vessels from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. The Navy acknowledged Robert's technological concept, but they had no interest whatsoever in finding the Titanic wreck. Navy officials said that they would only fund the project if Robert used the technology to locate two missing U.S. property Navy nuclear submarines, the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion, which had disappeared years earlier in the North Atlantic, and photographed their wrecks to determine the cause of their sinking and confirm whether the Soviet Union was involved during the Cold War. Under strict conditions of complete secrecy, the Navy agreed that if Robert completed the mission early, he could then use the remaining time to search for Titanic. Though Navy officials doubted Robert could accomplish both missions in such a short time, Robert accepted all the conditions and committed fully to developing his submersible technology. Not long after, he partnered with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution to develop a submersible called Argo, measuring 15 feet long, 3.5 feet high, and 3.5 feet wide. The system Robert developed was remotely operated, capable of providing clear visuals of the ocean floor. Once the technology was ready, in 1984 the U.S. Navy sent Robert and his team to the North Atlantic to locate the nuclear submarines. Using Argo, Robert quickly found the submarine wrecks. To the Navy, Argo was a success, but during that entire time, Robert had no opportunity to search for the Titanic, the original reason he had developed the system. It wasn't until 1985, when the Navy again sent Robert to map the wreck of the Scorpion, that he finally had a real chance to look for Titanic. This time, the Navy allowed him to use the remaining time to search for Titanic. At this point, Robert had the technology he had designed, the support of the Navy, and all he needed was a partner to carry out the work. So, he invited Louis Michel from the French Institute for Ocean Research to join. The Titanic search was divided into two phases, covering an area of 100 square miles. In the first phase, Michel and his team used sonar to begin scanning in order to identify potential targets. But after weeks of effort, even after scanning 75% of the area, Michel and his team still found no clues about the Titanic. The sonar system detected no shipwrecks and didn't identify any significant targets. Then, on the 22nd of August, 1985, Robert completed the Navy's mission and joined the Titanic search, beginning Phase 2. The problem was, Robert only had 12 days left, and if Titanic wasn't found in that time, he would return empty-handed. Repeated failures and the ticking clock left Robert at a dead end, but he still had full faith in Argo. To find Titanic in 12 days, Robert applied lessons from the Scorpion mission and developed an efficient plan. He decided not to look for the main hull, but to search for scattered debris first. Finding those would lead him straight to Titanic. He also knew that on the night Titanic sank, the ocean current was flowing south, so the debris likely drifted in that direction. Considering all these factors, he began searching with Argo in areas Michel hadn't scanned. Robert and his crew started guiding Argo, and as it moved along the seafloor, real-time images were transmitted back to the control screens. Days passed, and Argo's footage showed only rocks and sea creatures, not a single sign of the Titanic, not even a fragment. As the deadline approached, most of the team had nearly given up. But around 1 a.m. on the 1st of September, 1985, Argo suddenly detected a man-made object. Robert and the crew immediately fixed their eyes on the screen, and the object became increasingly clearer. A few minutes later, Robert and his team jumped in excitement because it was a boiler from the Titanic. After spotting the boiler, Argo continued forward. Not long after, the Titanic's wreck clearly appeared on screen, and the entire team burst into joy. Robert and his team had completed their mission on time, finding the Titanic. But right after that, their joy turned to silence as they realized it was nearly 2 a.m. the same time, 73 years earlier, when over 500 passengers lost their lives in these very waters. Robert Ballard had found Titanic after 73 years, marking a historic moment. The wreck lies about 700 kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, at a depth of 12,400 feet in the North Atlantic, and had broken into multiple pieces when the once luxurious ship reappeared after 73 years. Everyone was shocked by its devastation. The wreck was split in two, separated by over 2,000 feet. Seawater and bacteria had severely corroded it. After Titanic was discovered, many explorers, filmmakers, and scientists visited the site. Director James Cameron of the 1997 film Titanic also made several dives to see the wreck. In one interview, when asked if he had seen any human remains at the site, his answer left everyone silent. He said, while he didn't see bones or bodies, he saw 2 pairs of shoes, one confirmed to belong to a woman, and the other to a young girl. They were the shoes of a mother and her little daughter, who had embraced each other as the Titanic sank. Many years had passed, and although their bodies had dissolved in the seawater, their shoes remained as silent witnesses of their existence. Sadly, this wasn't an isolated case. Thousands perished in the tragedy after enduring painful final moments. Scientists studied the Titanic wreck and discovered that at the iceberg impact site, the White Star Line had used low-quality steel and brittle rivets. They did so to cut costs. Experts believe this negligence worsened the damage when the ship struck the iceberg. Seawater flooded in rapidly, causing the ship to sink in just 2 hours and 40 minutes. Had better materials been used, the flooding wouldn't have been as fast, and the ship might have taken longer to sink. In that case, the Carpathia could have arrived in time to save thousands. After Titanic was found, people began salvaging valuable and important items, such as jewelry, watches, crafts, hats, porcelain, and dinner plates. Many were publicly displayed, and some were sold at high prices. Among them, the violin of Wallace Hartley, the Titanic's bandleader, sold for over £1 million. At the same time, experts considered salvaging the entire Titanic from the seafloor. Interest in Titanic never faded, and many hoped to raise it for display in a museum. Hundreds of recovery proposals were made, but most were impractical, and the feasible ones were too costly, taking centuries to break even. No government or business was willing to shoulder the enormous cost, and no one could guarantee the operation would be safe. Experts feared that after years of corrosion, the Titanic had already become fragile, and raising it might cause it to disintegrate further or completely collapse on the seabed. For that reason, despite all the plans, Titanic remains on the ocean floor after 112 years. It continues to resist nature in the depths of the North Atlantic. Experts say that by the year 2030, the Titanic could completely vanish beneath the ocean's muddy floor.